Picture this. You are in a job interview. The interviewer slides a sheet of paper across the desk, and it contains a single question. Are you the smartest person who has ever lived in your city? You pause. You think about the scientists, the engineers, the writers, the mathematicians, the composers, the architects who have walked the same streets over the centuries. You think about the people whose names you know and the far larger number whose names history never recorded. And you give the only honest answer, almost certainly not. Now imagine the same question applied to the entire human species. Are we Homo sapiens, the current model, the version walking around in the 21st century, the smartest human beings who have ever existed? Are we the cognitive peak of the entire hominin lineage? Are we, in other words, the smartest humans there have ever been? Most people answer yes without thinking about it, because we have smartphones and antibiotics and space telescopes and the internet, and those feel like the outputs of the smartest possible minds. But those are the outputs of cumulative cultural knowledge, of millions of people building on the work of millions of previous people across thousands of years of recorded civilization. The question isn't whether our civilization is more technologically advanced than our ancestors. Of course it is. The question is whether the individual human brains doing the building are smarter than the brains of the ancient humans who came before us. And that question, whether any ancient human species possessed cognitive capacities equal to or exceeding our own, turns out to be considerably more complicated and considerably more unsettling than most people are prepared for. Define intelligence before examining ancient brains, because without a working definition, the question dissolves into circular reasoning. Intelligence is not a single thing. Modern cognitive science recognizes multiple distinct cognitive capacities: working memory, processing speed, spatial reasoning, linguistic ability, pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, social cognition, creative problem solving. That can be present in different configurations and different levels of development in different individuals and different species. The single number IQ model of intelligence has been substantially challenged by decades of research showing that the various components of what we call intelligence can dissociate. An individual can have extraordinary capacity in some dimensions and average capacity in others without any contradiction. This matters for the ancient intelligence question because asking which ancient human was smarter requires specifying smarter at what. Spatial reasoning in 3 dimensions, long-term episodic memory, social intelligence and theory of mind, the ability to track complex causal chains in the natural world, language, mathematical abstraction. These are all distinct capacities with distinct neural substrates, and ancient human species may have excelled at some while being less developed in others. The additional methodological challenge is that we cannot directly measure the intelligence of extinct species. We can examine brain size and shape from fossil endocasts. We can infer cognitive capacity from the complexity of archaeological material culture. We can look at the genetic variants associated with cognitive function and ask when they appeared in the hominin lineage. But none of these approaches gives us the cognitive test scores of a Neanderthal, and all of them involve interpretive assumptions that reasonable scientists can and do disagree about. With those caveats established, the evidence is more interesting than the confident assumption of modern human cognitive superiority would suggest. Brain size is the most frequently cited proxy for intelligence in discussions of ancient human cognition, and the data it produces is immediately surprising. Neanderthals had bigger brains than modern humans. Not slightly bigger. On average, Neanderthal brain volume was approximately 1,600 to 1,700 cubic centimeters, compared to a modern human average of approximately 1,350 cubic centimeters. The difference is substantial and consistent across the sample of Neanderthal specimens with measurable endocranial volume. Neanderthals were not small-brained archaic humans failing to approach modern cognitive capacity. They were, by the crudest available measure of neural tissue, better equipped than us. The obvious objection, and it is a valid one, is that brain size is not the same as intelligence. Elephants have larger brains than humans and aren't obviously smarter. Sperm whales have the largest brains of any animal. Brain size scaled to body size, encephalization quotient, is a better predictor of cognitive complexity across species than raw volume. And by that measure, humans come out ahead of Neanderthals despite the volume disadvantage, because Neanderthal bodies were also larger and more massively built. But the body size correction doesn't entirely dismiss the volume advantage. Cognitive capacity within the primate lineage correlates more strongly with absolute brain volume than encephalization quotient across species with similar body plans, because the neural resources available for high-level cognitive processing are more directly related to total neural tissue than to the ratio of brain to body. A Neanderthal brain with 1,700 cubic centimeters of neural tissue had more raw computational substrate than a modern human brain with 1,350 cubic centimeters. And dismissing that difference entirely requires more confidence in the body size correction than the underlying science supports. Brain shape is the counter-argument that modern human cognitive superiority advocates most frequently deploy, and it deserves careful examination because the anatomical differences are real and potentially meaningful. Modern human brains are distinctive in their shape compared to archaic human brains, including Neanderthals. The modern human brain case is rounded and globular in a way that Neanderthal brain cases are not. Neanderthal skulls are longer and lower, with a different overall proportioning of the brain regions within. Specifically, the modern human configuration involves relative expansion of the parietal lobes, which are involved in spatial integration, attention, and higher-order association functions, and the cerebellum, which beyond its traditional motor control roles is increasingly understood to participate in cognitive functions including language, working memory, and social cognition. The globularity hypothesis, the proposal that modern human cognitive distinctiveness is related to the specific shape of the modern human brain rather than its total size, has been influential in explaining how modern humans might have cognitive advantages over Neanderthals despite the volume disadvantage. Genetic variants associated with the development of the modern human brain's distinctive shape have been identified and appear to have emerged or become fixed relatively recently in the Homo sapiens lineage. The weakness of the globularity argument is that it reasons from anatomical differences to cognitive differences without a well-established mechanistic link between the anatomical variants and cognitive capacities. The parietal expansion in modern human brains is associated with regions involved in complex functions, but the relationship between parietal lobe size and parietal lobe function is not simple enough to allow confident conclusions about the cognitive consequences of the Neanderthal modern difference in parietal proportions. Brains don't scale in ways that allow straightforward more parietal lobe equals better spatial reasoning, particularly across species with different overall brain organizations. The archaeological record is where the cognitive comparison between modern humans and Neanderthals has been most intensively fought, and it is where the most dramatic revision of assumptions has occurred over the past 2 decades. The older view of Neanderthal cognition was condescending in a way that now looks like a product of assumption rather than evidence. Neanderthals were portrayed as culturally static, incapable of symbolic thought, limited to basic tool traditions that changed little over hundreds of thousands of years, lacking language, lacking art, lacking the behavioral flexibility that defines modern human cognition. This portrayal was partly based on the archaeological evidence available at the time, and partly on the interpretive assumption that the cognitive differences between Neanderthals and modern humans must have been dramatic to explain their replacement. The evidence has become considerably more complicated. Neanderthals buried their dead, in some cases apparently with grave goods, though the interpretation of these deposits is debated, suggesting a relationship to mortality and the dead that implies something more than purely material behavioral engagement with the world. They used pigments including ochre and manganese dioxide, sometimes apparently on their own bodies, in a behavior that implies symbolic self-presentation. They created personal ornaments from eagle talons and feathers, from shells, and from teeth at sites predating contact with modern humans and therefore not explainable as imitation of modern human cultural practices. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. At the Spanish sites of Ardales, La Pasiega, and Maltraveso, cave art has been dated using uranium-thorium methods to more than 65,000 years ago, a date that predates the arrival of modern humans in Europe by at least 25,000 years. If those dates are correct, and they have been defended vigorously against methodological criticisms, the art was made by Neanderthals. Not crude markings, but deliberate use of red pigment on speleothems and cave walls in a behavior that unambiguously qualifies as symbolic. This evidence has not been accepted by all researchers. Critics argue that the dating methods have uncertainties, that the pigment applications may have been accidental or non-symbolic, that the eagle talon ornaments might reflect behaviors with purely functional rather than symbolic explanations. The debate is not resolved. But the default assumption that Neanderthals were cognitively incapable of symbolic behavior is no longer defensible as a simple empirical claim. The evidence requires either concluding that they were symbolically capable or constructing increasingly elaborate alternative explanations for a growing body of findings pointing in the same direction. Neanderthal technology is another dimension of the cognitive comparison that has undergone significant reappraisal, and the reappraisal has consistently moved toward greater recognition of Neanderthal technical sophistication. The Mousterian stone tool industry associated with Neanderthals was long characterized as simpler and more static than the Upper Paleolithic industries associated with modern humans in Europe. The comparison is real at some level. Upper Paleolithic modern human assemblages do show more diversity of tool types, more use of bone and antler as raw materials, more evidence of long-distance raw material procurement, and other characteristics that appear more elaborate than most Mousterian assemblages. But the Mousterian is not the entire extent of Neanderthal technology, and recent analysis of Mousterian assemblages has revealed more complexity than earlier characterizations suggested. Neanderthals hafted stone tools, attaching worked stone to wooden handles, a process requiring multi-step planning, the use of adhesives like birch tar or pine resin, and the understanding that the completed tool will have properties different from either component alone. Birch tar production, which appears in Neanderthal archaeological contexts, requires a specific heat treatment process of bark that cannot be accomplished accidentally. It requires understanding and controlling a multi-stage manufacturing process. The Châtelperronian industry, a transitional tool tradition found at some Neanderthal sites that shows characteristics otherwise associated with modern human Upper Paleolithic traditions, has been interpreted as evidence of Neanderthals independently developing more sophisticated technologies or adopting them from contact with modern humans. Whether the Châtelperronian represents independent Neanderthal innovation or cultural borrowing, it demonstrates a capacity for technological flexibility and change that contradicts the static cognitive image. Language is the capacity most central to human cognitive distinctiveness, and the question of whether Neanderthals possessed language in any meaningful sense is the most consequential unresolved question in the cognitive comparison. The anatomical prerequisites for modern human speech are partially present in Neanderthals. The FOXP2 gene, associated with fine motor control of speech and with language development in modern humans, exists in Neanderthals in the same modern human form, confirmed through ancient DNA analysis. The hyoid bone, which supports the larynx and reflects the anatomical configuration of the vocal tract, is present in Neanderthals in a form similar to modern humans, suggesting a vocal tract capable of the range of sounds used in human speech. The ear canal dimensions in Neanderthal skulls, analyzed through CT reconstruction, are consistent with sensitivity to the same frequency range as modern human hearing. The frequency range most important for speech perception. These anatomical and genetic findings establish that Neanderthals had the physical equipment for language. They do not establish that Neanderthals used that equipment for language, or what level of linguistic complexity they achieved if they did. The cognitive prerequisites for language, the ability to combine symbols into structured sequences with hierarchical meaning, to understand recursive grammatical structures, to use language for planning, narrative, and social coordination, are not directly accessible from anatomy. The circumstantial behavioral evidence, however, points toward Neanderthal communication sophistication greater than non-linguistic signals. The maintenance of tool-making traditions across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, traditions that require precise transmission of procedural knowledge that would be extremely difficult to maintain reliably without verbal instruction, implies at least functional language for technical knowledge transmission. The evidence for long-distance movement of raw materials, for group hunting of large, dangerous prey, and for the social coordination implied by living in groups of sufficient complexity to produce the observed archaeological patterns is consistent with language as a facilitating mechanism. The type of intelligence where ancient human species may have most dramatically exceeded modern humans, and this is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of the entire question, is practical environmental intelligence. The capacity for detailed, nuanced, experience-based understanding of the natural world. A Neanderthal who survived to adulthood in the periglacial environments of Pleistocene Europe possessed ecological knowledge of a depth and precision that would be extraordinary by any measure. They knew the specific behavioral patterns of the prey species they hunted, the seasonal movements of reindeer herds, the specific terrain features that channeled mammoth movement, the exact circumstances under which a bison became vulnerable to ambush. They knew which plants were available in which microhabitats at which times of year, which were edible, which were medicinal, which were toxic, and how to prepare each category appropriately. They knew weather not from forecasts, but from the direct reading of atmospheric signals accumulated over decades of experience in a landscape. They knew stone, which quarries produced flint suitable for tool types, which heat treatment processes improved knapping quality, which cobbles found in riverbeds had the fracture properties needed for particular implements. They knew fire, not just how to maintain it, but how to produce it reliably from available materials under adverse conditions, which is a more demanding technical challenge than it appears from the safety of a world with matches. This environmental intelligence is not what modern IQ tests measure. It is not what academic achievement measures. It is the kind of intelligence that modern cognitive science has labeled naturalist intelligence or ecological rationality, and it is the kind of intelligence for which evolutionary pressures were most intense throughout the vast majority of human evolutionary history. Modern humans living in environments almost entirely mediated by technology and cultural infrastructure experience almost none of the selection pressure for this type of intelligence. Ancient human species, including Neanderthals, experienced intense selection for it across hundreds of thousands of generations. Homo floresiensis, the diminutive hominin from the Indonesian island of Flores, sometimes called the Hobbit, presents a completely different dimension of the intelligence question that has fascinated and puzzled researchers since the initial discovery in 2003. Homo floresiensis had a brain approximately one-third the volume of modern humans, smaller even than Homo habilis and approaching the brain sizes of Australopithecus. By the raw brain volume measure, Homo floresiensis should have had extremely limited cognitive capacity. And yet the archaeological context at Liangbua Cave includes stone tools of reasonable sophistication, evidence of fire use, and remains of stegodon, a large elephant-like animal, suggesting that this tiny-brained hominin was capable of coordinated hunting or processing of large prey, and of systematic tool manufacture. The Homo floresiensis case is a cautionary example against overconfident conclusions from brain size measures in either direction. A species with a brain volume that would place it among the great apes rather than the hominins appears to have maintained technological and behavioral capacities that the brain size would not predict. The specific cognitive architecture of the Homo floresiensis brain, how its limited neural tissue was organized and allocated among different cognitive functions, apparently supported behavior more sophisticated than raw volume suggests. This implies that the relationship between brain size and intelligence is even less straightforward than the caveats around the Neanderthal comparison suggest. Neural organization, connectivity, regional allocations, and the developmental processes that establish brain architecture may matter as much or more than total volume in determining cognitive capacity. The honest answer to which ancient human species was smarter than modern humans is possibly none, probably some in domains, and certainly the question is more complicated than the confident assumption of modern supremacy allows. In raw brain volume, Neanderthals exceed modern humans. In types of practical environmental intelligence, all archaic human species that survived to adulthood in the environments they occupied were almost certainly operating at levels that would be extraordinary by modern standards applied to the same context. In symbolic behavior, the evidence increasingly suggests Neanderthal capacity that is not categorically different from early modern human behavior. In linguistic ability, the anatomical and genetic prerequisites were present in Neanderthals, and the behavioral evidence is consistent with functional language even if its specific character remains inaccessible. Where modern humans plausibly had advantages, the specific neural architecture reflected in brain shape differences, the particular combination of cognitive capacities that supported cumulative cultural evolution, and the rapid diversification of symbolic behavior visible in the Upper Paleolithic, those advantages appear to have been differences of degree in specific dimensions rather than categorical differences in the presence or absence of higher cognitive function. The modern human assumption of cognitive superiority over all previous human species reflects the same bias that makes it comfortable to assume that people alive today are smarter than people from the past. We evaluate intelligence through our own culturally specific measures, and find ourselves at the top by definition. A Neanderthal, evaluating intelligence through the measures most relevant to Neanderthal survival: ecological knowledge, technical skill with stone, ability to hunt large dangerous prey in periglacial environments through coordinated group strategy, might arrive at a different conclusion about which species had the cognitive edge. The unsettling possibility, and it is a possibility, not a certainty, is that the species sitting in job interviews, building data centers, and writing content about ancient human intelligence may not actually be the smartest humans who have ever walked the earth, just the most recent ones, and the most technologically encumbered ones, and the ones doing the measuring, which is, when you think about it for more than 30 seconds, exactly the kind of result you should expect when the species doing the intelligence test is also the one writing the questions.